Hey, Harford County. I'm Emily Adolph of The Soul Lift. You may remember me as a guest on Rich's podcast. Well, I'm back with something special.
And I'm Ona Crow. We're introducing Nourish and Connect, a gathering space designed to bring people together that feels authentic, supportive, and uplifting.
This is about real relationships, shared wisdom, and growth.
Our gatherings nourish with mindful experiences and reflective activities to leave you inspired.
And they're designed to connect with intentional conversations and welcoming community where you truly belong.
They're the second Wednesday of every month. Join us on April 9th at Doss Beer Hall in Bel Air from 5:30 to 7 p.m. to celebrate spring.
And mark your calendars for May 14th and June 11th. We have amazing experiences planned for summer.
Come as you are and let's grow together.
Hey everyone, it's Rich Bennett. Can you believe it? The show is turning 10 this year. I am so grateful for each and every one of you who've tuned in, shared an episode, or even joined the conversation over the years. You're the reason that this podcast has grown into what it is today. Together, we've shared laughs, tears, and moments that truly matter. So I want to thank you for being part of this journey. Let's make the next 10 years even better.
Coming to you from the Freedom Federal Credit Union Studios, Harford County Living presents Conversations with Rich Bennett.
Slow pitch
It's probably the least sexy part of the work, and I don't know. It's okay. No. The truth is,
Today, I'm honored to welcome Andrew Serra to Conversations with Rich Bennett. Andrew is an acclaimed author known for his historical novels and powerful storytelling. His latest book, Hell's 100 Acres, takes us back to one of the deadliest workplace tragedies in American history, the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. In this gripping novel, Andrew explores the corrupt politics of the time, the devastating loss of 146 lives, mostly young immigrant women, and the crucial fight for improved safety laws that followed. He's been featured on Fox 5 New York and NY1 News, and today he's here to share the deeper story behind his work. But before we get into it, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a retired firefighter, right?
I am, yeah. I retired last year after 25 years.
I want to thank you for your service, something I believe that first responders do not hear enough. But yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
So, I take it you were writing before you retired.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've been writing since grammar school. Always enjoyed it. I love storytelling and being creative, and just the act of writing and putting a story together. My first novel actually came out in 2012.
Oh wow!
So, I've been at it for a while.
So wait, and what novel was that?
It was called The Dead Florentines. It's a historical novel about the Italian Renaissance, basically.
And that was 2013?
Yeah, 2012, yeah.
Or 2012. And you've released 8 books since then?
I guess total, yeah. I think it was 5 full books, and I have a series, ebook series that of shorts, connected short stories on Kindle about it's also a historical novel based about. It's called The Tenement. It's about a building built in the 1800s in New York City.
So these are all novels.
Yeah, with one exception. I have one nonfiction book, 9/11 memoir that came out in 2018.
When do you sleep?
I find time, between writing is, when I have a chance, and I get probably most of my writing done early in the morning. I tend to wake up early, and I find that to be the best time of the day to write.
All right. So now that you're retired, are you a full-time entrepreneur, or are you still working?
I guess that's how I describe myself. Yeah.
Okay.
I took maybe a month or two to, when the dust settled, it was, and then, trying to think about what my, the next chapter is going to be, no pun intended, and, and then, I landed on the idea for this book, and I felt it was kind of like, I'm still in the fire world, and it really started as more focused on, because the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, as you mentioned, a lot of it has to do with my old firehouse down in Soho, Manhattan, because they were one of the first fire units on the scene at this fire. So it was part of my firehouse's history, this fire. So I wanted to delve into that a little bit, and then it kind of grew from just talking about my old firehouse to creating a whole story around the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire and the people who worked in the factory and the politicians of the time and all that stuff.
I'll be honest with you, I never heard of that fire until your book.
Yeah, outside of New York, it's probably much less known. Here, it's still, pretty. Every year they have a memorial on March 25th. Down at the site. The building is still there. It's part of NYU now. It's part of it's a school building for New York University, so it's still there. They built a beautiful memorial on the front of it, and they have a ceremony every year, and so it's a little bit more prominent probably here. But yeah.
But the thing is, something like that, I think it's important to where people everywhere know about things like this.
I think even if they've never heard of it, it's affected their lives because a lot of the fire safety regulations in place today stem from that fire. And even the effectiveness of unions and later the New Deal. I would argue that the beginning of the New Deal was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire because a lot of the players went on to be prominent members of FDR's administration and the growth of the New Deal.
So how much research actually went into this? Because it's still a novel.
It
right?
is a novel. And, I kind of let the story and the characters take me in whatever direction I felt that, they needed to go. It was a lot of research, but, people have asked me about this before. Compared to maybe some of my other books, it wasn't that difficult to research. There's a lot written about this fire. There's a lot of great nonfiction books that I leaned on that are out there. There's films, documentaries, and there are other novels and stuff like that have been written about it. So I wasn't treading new territory, I would say, or discovering some hidden fact that no one's ever heard of before. I just tried to keep my focus simple, and I said, well, what can I bring to this story? And I figured a tight handful of people from different walks of life who all intersected at this fire and tell their stories, tell their everyday lives, what was going on in their lives, what led them to this moment, and what came of it afterwards. That's what I tried to bring new to the story.
So was it actually hard to balance the historical accuracy with the storytelling in the book?
Probably for my, I guess maybe an avid nonfiction writer might argue the opposite. I find it's with historical fiction, at least, you have a little bit more liberty. Because you are writing a novel, you're writing, it's a fictional creation, and the story should win out. You want it to be historically accurate in terms of giving the feel, and the important facts should be real. And, I always say as a historical novelist, I have a duty, not to make a villain into a hero, not to make a hero into a villain. But other than that, no one knows what they had for breakfast that day. So you can make it up. You know what I mean? Or, if a character, went in this direction, or this was the basic event in their life, you get to create the conversations that made this event happen. So you have a little bit more leeway as far as bringing the facts forward and bringing the story forward as being a novel, as opposed to if I were writing a narrative nonfiction, which, is probably a very difficult thing to do. It's not just a history book, but it's not fiction. Whereas you want to create, a very in-depth story but everything has to be true. You have to be accurate, and that's a different type of writing altogether.
Yeah, I don't think people realize when it comes to historical fiction, I believe it's a lot harder to write than just your regular fiction novel.
I think it's, because, you
have to be accurate.
Right. You have license, I think, to maybe create, take two minor events and make them into one event to move the story along. You have some license that way. But I do think you have a duty, to give like an overall faithfulness to real events.
Yeah.
And like I said, if someone's a real life villain, you don't want to be overly sympathetic. You want to make them more complex. It's rarely black and white. They usually have many different motives. They're human. They have some good in them. All those things are true. But there's certain things that you want to align with reality, but you have a little bit more freedom. I think historical fiction is a great genre to work in for me, and I enjoy reading it.
Me too.
It's a great way. Sometimes it can be more effective way of learning about the past even than actual just reading straight up history, because you get to see it through human eyes, and often, depending on when the book is written, a lot of times historical fiction can teach you more about the time it was written, as much about the time it was written as the time it's written about. So a Civil War book, say, written in 1910, there's a chance it might have a very different feel than a Civil War book written today, and the characters are going to be looked at from a different perspective. And that has its benefits and that has its pitfalls, obviously,
I still think one of the best Civil War books I ever read was, and I forget the title, but it was a bunch of letters that they found from the soldiers, and they compiled them into a book. And of course, those letters told the story itself. Oh
yeah, that's. I'd like to find that, maybe, if you think of it later.
I'll find it. Once I find it, I know I got it laying around here somewhere. I'll let you know. But there's two of them. There's one from the South and one from the North.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me different. It's not it's not a book, it's a movie, but Letters from Iwo Jima.
Oh my God.
Clint Eastwood movie, which I'm a big fan of. And what's funny, I remember, and I mean, who's more patriotic than Clint Eastwood, right? He shouldn't have to explain himself to anyone, but he got some grief, I think, for being overly sympathetic, I think, to the Japanese side, and I didn't get that at all from the movie. I think it humanized these figures, and in particular this general from the Japanese army stationed out on Iwo Jima, from his personal letters home, and also some of the soldiers and all, and they're human beings. They fought this war for their own reasons, just like the Allied soldiers fought for their own reasons, and I don't see anything wrong with exploring those reasons and making the characters human. And I thought it was a great movie.
It was. Absolutely. So with Hell's 100 Acres, were there any personal connections or discoveries actually during your research that made the story even more meaningful to you?
Well, for me, there was, an indirect personal connection. Like I said, my firehouse was one of the first companies on the scene. So the lore, the legend per se, or the story of this fire was always present in our firehouse. On the walls, we have framed New York Times, articles from the day after the fire hanging up. Wow. It's a big part of the history of every year. For that memorial service that comes, we go to the scene of the service with our truck and put the ladder up, because a big moment in this fire, and the ladder couldn't reach the upper floor windows where the people were trapped. So they go there, even though today the ladder does reach up there. They've gotten longer over the years, but we put the ladder up to the lower floor, the 6th floor window where the ladder at the time topped out. And it creates a very stark visual that, the people above, if people in the street must have seen people above up on the 9th floor trapped, that this ladder wouldn't reach them. So they put this, so it's a very much a part of my company. It's Ladder Company 20 of the FDNY. It's a very big part of the company's history. And some of the characters that were in the firehouse at the time, I was able to interview one the grandson of one of the firefighters, from and he had a lot of great stories, and that were very helpful for me, in crafting my story. And so from that angle, I think, but I knew that going in, and that's that's what I was hoping for. But then as I expanded into the story of the fire altogether and the other characters and the other people involved, I think I was pleasantly surprised, I guess. I don't know if it's the right word, of how I was drawn into their story, like the seamstresses and, you know, some of the political figures of the time, how, I didn't know, I didn't know how easy it would, if it would be easy or not, or difficult to tell their story, you know? And, because, you know, you know, you're writing someone that you have nothing in common with. You know, these were very recent immigrants mostly from Eastern Europe. You know, so they had a very different life than the life they were seamstresses, worked very long hours in this factory and, you know, lived with a lot of hardships, you know, came from poverty, you know, they lived on the Lower East Side in tenement buildings, you know, in very, you know, tight conditions. And, there's, you know, I leaned on, the people themselves. There's mostly women that, who survived and told their stories, you know, and there's a lot of, resources online of them, you know, interviews they did later in life and told what their life was like. And that was very interesting for me to dive into that world and try. I hope I was able to do justice to their experiences. You know?
Is there like a museum or anything for
this actual fire or?
Yeah, or is part of it in a museum anywhere? Because when you mentioned the fire truck, I'm like, man, if that old fire truck was still around. Yeah,
the actual. Well, I mean, there's a number of different resources. The New York City Fire Department has a New York City Fire Museum,
right?
Which is great. They're actually temporarily closed. Hopefully, they open again soon. They had. They're building a high-rise building across the street, and the shaking moved the foundation of the. Good
Lord.
Of the museum. The museum's an old firehouse. It's a beautiful building. And, but I actually visited when I was doing my research, and they have, you know, you could see some of the fire trucks from the era, you know, to get a feel for them and see them. And they also have a little, section dedicated to the Triangle Fire. NYU has a center. I think it's under their Italian studies program because, many of the seamstresses who died were Italian immigrants.
Italian, right.
There were about, maybe, if I had to guess, probably 60-40 of percentage-wise of Eastern European Jewish and Italian immigrants. These mostly young women who died, the seamstresses. So in the Italian program of NYU, they have a center and they had an exhibit. I don't know if it's still open, and that I visited dedicated to the women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And Cornell University also has a...
Oh, really?
Cornell, they have an online database of documentary evidence from the fire under their labor relations studies department because, you know, union rules and labor, history of labor strikes, and, you know, that's where... the angle they're looking at it from, but they have a lot of great resources if you want to learn about the fire. It's Cornell University's Center for Labor Studies. It's a website, you know.
Okay.
In the back of my book, I list the sources if anyone wants to check them out.
Actually, if you could sit down with one of the survivors of the fire, what would you want to ask them?
You know, that's a good question. You know, it seems like they all... You know, I admire a lot of their courage because it seems like, you know, that's you think of the lives they lived even before the fire. Most of them, you know, they escaped in some instances terrible, you know, violent persecutions in their home country or extreme poverty, and came here with nothing. And and they're very young to have lived such lives like that, and then to work long hours in this factory, and then. You know, they could have just afterwards, you know, that just the, you know, today we know about you know, post-traumatic stress and things like that, where something like that could have destroyed a person. A lot of them went on to, you know, live very long, you know, in ways successful lives of, you know, families and, you know, and so, you know, they move forward and they told the stories of the, you know, the victims and the tragedy, and they kept it alive. They fought for change. They, you know, banded together to change the laws afterwards. So I think I would ask maybe a survivor, you know, I think I got from so many survivors' accounts that, what the day was like, or, maybe, just ask them, 20 years later, or 30 years later, how they felt about the fire, how they feel, looking back at things like that,
Actually, when you were writing this, because as an author, I'm sure you just get like wrapped up into it, like you're there, which in a good book, when you're reading it, you feel like you're there. What was the hardest part for you to write because it was so emotional to you?
I wanted to be graphic without like being overly like it's not like a horror movie, like, blood splashing just for the sake of violence. I don't want to be gory, but I wanted to be graphic and real, The one, like I said before, I didn't feel like I was uncovering any new information or but one aspect I feel probably that might, as opposed to other people who have written about this fire that I was coming at, was from a firefighting point of view. So, the last third of the book, deals with, the actual fire. I felt like perhaps I had a unique experience of how to describe what it's like to be in a fire, as opposed to, maybe as opposed to somebody else who hasn't, so I tried to maybe bring that forward in the story of what it's really like to be in a fire. Cause you see, Hollywood with movies and how they show fires, and it's really nothing like what it's like to be in an actual fire, the things that, that stick out at you, the smoke, the darkness of it, it's just black smoke overtakes everything, and the way the heat moves, and, and the compressed time frame of, it's seconds can seem like hours, it's a very unique experience.
Right. So the book actually explores the political corruption of the time.
Yeah. How
did that corruption contribute to the tragedy?
Well, I think, you can't really talk about the fire without the politics of the era.
Right.
I think it was kind of a turning point for New York City politics. For those maybe listening who aren't really familiar with New York City politics, the 19th century in New York City was the era of Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall was a political like club, an organization that basically was the de facto headquarters of the Democratic Party in New York City, and by extension then the de facto government of New York City. They controlled all levels of power in the city. And and we see things starting to change right around the turn of the century. Some things happen. They're almost, a victim of their own success, Tammany Hall. They're at the zenith of their power because New York City, you have to remember, in the 19th century New York City was Manhattan. And Brooklyn was its own city. Queens was just a county, and Long Island City was on the end of it. So, and Richmond County, which is Staten Island, was completely separate. So New York City was Manhattan. And then in 1897, with the, backroom, machine politics and deals up in Albany at the state legislature, all these things combined, and then deals between the mayor of Brooklyn and the mayor of New York City and the mayor of Long Island City. Everything coalesces, and now they form a new mega city. The five boroughs come together as one in right at the end of the 19th century, and the Greater New York is formed. And you would think like, oh, Tammany Hall, in many ways, rode this train or engineered it really to happen. And they get a Tammany friendly, handpicked mayor elected, and all these things are going on. And right around the same time, you have a crusading new governor up in Albany who comes into power, Teddy Roosevelt. And he's very popular. He's back from the Spanish-American War. He's a folk hero, and he plays a different kind of politics. He's a Republican. He's progressive in a lot of ways, and he has very little patience for the old way of doing things. He's not a friend of Tammany Hall at all. So the Tammany leaders and the political leaders in New York State, trying to figure out how they can deal with this new governor who's making things difficult for them. Well, they get the Republican Party to make him vice president in 1900 to basically get rid of him, get him out of New York. And the vice president,
wow.
The vice presidency is a dead end, political career. It's looked upon that way. In a lot of ways, in some ways it is,
Right.
So he's, has no real power. He's out of everyone's hair and he's off and he's vice president. And a few months into, the first term of his vice presidency, President McKinley is assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, and if they thought they had problems when Teddy Roosevelt was governor, now he's president, So, the progressive era sweeps in and there's a lot of reforms, civil service reform, which had actually started before Teddy Roosevelt. But it was really growing. And right around the turn of the century, civil service reform is, really at its height. And that was probably the largest part of Tammany Hall's power. Basically, they would hand out jobs for votes, So if you were, the police departments, the fire departments, civil service, all, up and down the ladder, they would hand out jobs and they wanted your vote in return, so that's how they held on to their power with patronage in a lot of ways. And now with civil service reform, they can't do that. So now they have to find other ways of holding on to power at Tammany Hall. And so now they have to cozy up to business interests probably more than in the past. But you have this progressive wave coming in at the same time, and they have to try and balance it, So, so you see, there's a push for reform even before the fire, and it has to be balanced with the business interests. And Tammany's kind of at this, crossroads of these two competing interests.
Right. Actually, with that, because there were a lot of obstacles that reformers faced, especially in pushing for better safety laws after the fire. Can you tell us some of those obstacles?
Well, in the lead up to the fire, there had been a push ahead. The chief of the New York City Fire Department at the time was named Edward Croker. He's a big part of my book because he's such an interesting story, really, his whole life. His uncle was the leader of Tammany Hall, Richard Croker. A lot of people have probably heard of Boss Tweed, in like the 1870s, he was very corrupt, a very famous leader of Tammany Hall. But then after, his downfall, you have probably the next big Tammany leader is Richard Croker. And, he basically, through, like I said, these patronage jobs, he gets his nephew appointed to the fire department, and then his nephew, and then 3 months later, he gets his nephew appointed to lieutenant. At the time, they called it assistant foreman, which is unheard of and ridiculous by today's standards that someone with 3 months experience can be, leading firefighters, and, but it happens. And so it would be easy to just pigeonhole Edward Croker and say, well, he's Tammany Hall corruption and, but he grew into, he worked, he kind of had he basically told his uncle, after that, appointment and promotion that he wanted no more help from him. He wanted to do things on his own, and he worked hard and learned the job and worked his way up the ranks of the fire department on his own, so much so that when there was an opening for the top chief job, the commissioner, I think, genuinely wanted him because he was the best person for the job. And even that, was a bit of a mini scandal because, the newspapers ran with the story that, Richard Croker's nephew is appointed chief of the fire department, even so much so that the Civil Service Commission that I mentioned, who was from Albany, they didn't like Tammany Hall. They stepped in, they heard that the mayor, the fire commissioner appointed a new fire chief. And they said, no, you need a civil service test. This has to be fair. This has to be, So they gave a test for all the high-ranking chiefs to take to see who was going to be officially appointed the next chief of department. And Richard Croker outscored all the other chiefs anyway. So he was, he becomes chief in, I think, 1900, or 1899. He becomes chief. And for over a decade, he's the top chief, and he becomes very well respected. The newspapers all, they turn to him, and he becomes a national leader in fire safety. And he's a very honest and hardworking civil servant by all accounts, And so he's pushing for reforms for that whole decade, really. There's a couple of very, terrible, tragic examples of large losses of lives in fires outside of New York. And he's making the case in the state legislature and at the city council level that New York needs improved fire safety laws. He wanted sprinklers in every factory, which was, a no-go from the start. The factory owners fought him tooth and nail.
And this was back in the early 1900s?
Yeah, early 1900s. He wanted these things even before the fire. He fought for sprinklers and got nowhere. He fought for fire drills on factory floors, which would have made a huge difference at the Triangle Fire. And, he went nowhere because the loss of productivity. A fire drill, the owners argued it took a half hour out of productivity, to do a drill.
Oh, good Lord.
But the one thing he had success with, Edward Croker, was he fought for and got the city to build a high-pressure water system in downtown Manhattan. Because there were old fire hydrants that were connected to the water mains, the same drinking water you get in your building, the hydrants were connected to. But particularly in Lower Manhattan at this time, you're building these bigger and bigger buildings, mostly factory lofts in this area. But any kind of high-rise building, anything over 8 stories now is for the old water mains. There wasn't enough pressure to reach the upper floors, because you're fighting against gravity, to bring, even if you stretch a hose line up, wind it up a set of stairs, the water's fighting the gravity, to get it up to these upper floors, and there wasn't enough pressure. Even with hooking up to a steam pumper of the day, they couldn't do it. And he did get in the middle of that first decade of the 20th century, they built a giant pumping station on the Hudson River, and built these big large diameter water mains across Lower Manhattan with these special hydrants. They were like twice as wide as regular hydrants just for this area. And that actually made a difference at the Triangle Fire. That was one of the sad ironies of the Triangle Fire. It was a massive loss of life, and in many ways the conditions encountered by the firefighters were it was outpaced the technology they had, right? The ladders weren't tall enough. The gear they were wearing wasn't, it wasn't anything like we have today, but they had water. The fire actually, it was a heavy amount of fire on mostly 2 floors. It started on the 8th floor, which became fully involved in fire. And this is a large factory, open factory space. It's a big building, big floor. The 8th floor is fully involved in fire, and then eventually the 9th floor becomes fully involved in fire. And from the time the firefighters got on the scene and got up to these floors and hooked up hoses, the fire went out pretty quickly, believe it or not. From the receipt of the alarm, I think, until the fire was placed under control, if I'm not mistaken, was like 18 minutes.
Wow.
And that's, it's not a terrible long, and that's that's not including the time, the alarm may have been translated 2 or 3 minutes after the fire actually started. You have to remember, but from receipt of the alarm, I think it was 18 minutes, and they estimate the entire, from first spark to the fire being completely extinguished was, like 25 minutes or less than 30 minutes. It was too late for, these victims, obviously, because they were trapped. And when you're burning, you have seconds to make a decision. And the only decision left to many of these victims was to jump out the windows of these upper floors. But at least, back to your original question, with Edward Croker, actual water pressure was not an issue. For all the obstacles faced and in many ways, they weren't equipped to deal with this, but they did have water.
You're listening to Conversations with Rich Bennett. We'll be right back. With this unpredictable Maryland weather, I want to talk about someone I truly trust to keep my home cozy. EcoCool HVAC. These folks are not just any HVAC service. They're a veteran-owned business right here in Harford County. Why do I trust them? Well, first off, they've been serving our community reliably since 2010. The owner, Stephen Cordell, and his team take immense pride in their rapid response time and exceptional customer service. They're always there when you need them, making sure you're never left in the heat or the cold. Being veteran-owned, they bring that same dedication and integrity to their business that they brought to serving our country. They're committed to excellence, always focusing on top quality service and the finest workmanship. So if you're looking for an expert this season to keep your home or business comfortable, give EcoCool HVAC a call at 443-324-9714. Again, that's 443-324-9714. Tell them Rich sent you, or visit them online at ecocoolhvac.com. Trust me, with EcoCool HVAC, you're in good hands.
Oh, man. Did any idea how the fire started?
The best guess that investigators were able to piece together was that it was smoking on a cigarette on the 8th floor. The 8th floor of the factory. So now this is a big building, right? It's a loft. It's 10 stories.
Right.
And the Triangle Waist Company, they called. If anyone doesn't know, a shirtwaist was a type of women's blouse from the early 20th century. You know, if you saw one, you know it. You know, it's like
what
usually
it is,
like a ruffly shoulder patch and, you know, just a button-down blouse that was very popular for from 1900 to 1920. Mm-hmm. And the Triangle Company was the biggest manufacturer of them all, the most successful. And they had the top 3 floors of this building with most of the sewing going on the 9th floor. They had 270 sewing machines on the 9th floor. But on the 8th floor, they had what they call cutters stations. And the cutters was a very skilled worker. If you've ever seen those big scissors that tailors use, and they had assistants on a big work table. They would stack fabric really thick, up to 20 or more pieces of fabric stacked on top of each other. And they would cut templates of the garment, and then they would send them upstairs for the seamstresses to sew them together. So there was these big tables with cutters. There was large stacks of rolls of fabric next to them, and hanging from the ceiling were the actual templates that they used to, as guides. So they would cut the shape that needed to be made out of fabric, and then they would put a tiny little tin border to hold it taut, and then hang it from strings from the ceiling. So these things are hanging all over. So you had a very big fire load. It's all kindling basically. And underneath the cutters' workstations were waste bins that these little, there would be scraps left over when they did these cuttings, and they'd push them into the waste bins. They didn't really empty these waste bins like you would think, twice a day they would empty them. They would sit there for days or sometimes weeks. So they were always full. The one, the Triangle factory, like all factories at the time, they had very few fire safety regulations in place. One thing they did have was no smoking. That was an zero tolerance for smoking. If you were caught, even before the fire on Triangle smoking, you were fired instantly. So they knew, that there was no smoking allowed on the factory floor. In this instance, something like this, ironically, it may have contributed to the fire because, if they were allowed to smoke, they probably would have walked to the window and smoked. And,
right.
And here in this instance, the cutter, whoever was smoking was probably, crouched next to his desk smoking, hiding it. And then, when the manager's walking over, he threw it in the waste bin or, you can imagine somehow a cigarette butt or a match ended up in one of these waste bins and it took off very quickly. The manager, the factory manager fought the fire for a few minutes, which, in hindsight, he probably his efforts would have been better spent evacuating people. But there were buckets of water, stationed around the floor, and he dumped a few buckets of water on top of the bin. But the fire just was moving too quickly. There was too much for it to burn, and it just became out of control very quickly.
I guess back at that time they didn't have fire extinguishers, right? I mean,
no, it was buckets of water.
Wow.
If extinguishers were coming into play, they were usually just gravity fed. You would turn it upside down and the hose would feed it out, or it was just a bucket of water, Pressurized extinguishers, I think, came a little bit later, if I'm not mistaken. Either way, Triangle didn't have them, So.
Right. So did you uncover any historical details that actually changed the way you initially envisioned the story while writing this?
Yeah. Like I tried to, even from the owners of the factory who were greedy and in my mind guilty, and they stood trial and were acquitted after the fire. They had a very good lawyer, but and like I said at the earlier in the conversation, I feel as a historical novelist, like you're not gonna. There's no version of the story where they're the good guys. You know what I mean? The two owners, it was partners, and absolutely not. But they're also human beings like everybody else. So rather than just the typical villain, greedy villain, I wanted to explore a little bit of like, well, where did they come from? What was their point of view? And and it's not as black and white, cut and dry as just these greedy millionaires squeezing every penny. They were immigrants themselves. They worked their way up from nothing. They worked in sweatshops and worked their way up through the garment industry and saved and scrimped and started companies and built up this empire. And in a lot of ways, from their point of view, which I'm not saying I agree with them, but from their point of view, the Triangle Factory was a step up. It was better. We use the term sweatshop a lot to mean any kind of factory from this era. But the Triangle Factory really wasn't a sweatshop in the true sense of the word. The word comes from probably a generation earlier. And what you had going on was you had a lot of small-time manufacturers in tenement buildings, in their apartment, putting sewing machines in the main room of the tenement. They would squeeze 4 sewing machines facing each other, and there were foot pedal powered machines, and there was very little light, no ventilation, and the sides of the apartments would be just stacked to the ceiling with fabrics and garments and finished pieces. And you had runners, taking crates, when the women would sew, they'd take the crate and run it blocks away to some, some central where and the owners of these small little tenement factories, they were basically independent contractors. They got paid from the umbrella company by the piece. The more garments they produced, the more they made, and they in turn paid the seamstresses by the piece, by the finished piece. So there were very few breaks. They would, from early in the morning till late at night, they were just sewing. So it was in everybody's interest to squeeze the most amount of, number of garments out of these seamstresses. So they called that sweating, sweating to get every single piece to maximize the volume. That's where the term sweating comes from. It's not really just about, it was hot and sweaty I didn't
know that.
That was a sweatshop, so now when these factory lofts start getting built, later in the 1800s, and these companies start moving to these loft spaces with these big windows and plenty of light, plenty of fresh air, even though conditions by our standards are still terrible for these workers. They were seen in a lot of ways, even by the women. You read the stories of the seamstresses themselves, and they considered like going to Triangle like as a better job than the jobs they had come from before. Right. So in a lot of ways, like these owners, had the attitude like, well, who's complaining if they have plenty of fresh air, plenty of light, plenty. I wish I had it that good when I would, So like. It's so there's like that human, and that's the way these tragedies happen. Like no one thinks they're wrong when they're everyone they're making decisions thinking that they're making the right decision. So these owners want they felt like they were running a successful company, employing hundreds of people, and that was their attitude. And they were greedy.
Yeah. What's one of the biggest things that you hope readers take away from this?
I I think, like I said, keeping the goals, narrow at the beginning. Like, it's just, say if there's like maybe 4 or 6 main characters that I, just remember that, the fullness of their lives, and the story that makes us all human, 146 people died, and you hear that, and it's a statistic, right? It's a big number, but it's really, it's 146 individual tragedies. These are 146 families that were devastated. Mm-hmm. That, their daughter didn't come home that night. It's just, I tried to keep, add that, it's almost like, a remembrance of that these were all, unique, full lives that, that were brought together and in some ways, tragically affected by it.
See, and a lot of people don't realize when it comes to something like that, even one tragedy can add up to more tragedies just from that one person. So 146 tragedies, that's just from the fire. But think about how many more people were affected from that.
Right. How many
that have either passed away or whatever.
Right.
You never
I mean,
know.
There's in some instances, like, the person who died was the breadwinner for the family. And how many children went hungry, or, if in the case of a seamstress, if the father wasn't in the picture, now they were in foster care or to the wind, or, it's like, and there's really there's no data on that, no. There was no follow-up.
I don't think there ever can be.
It's individual family stories that survived. Just, my grandmother was there, and then my mother was born, so individual families might have their own stories, but there was never any like, follow-up on like a statistical level of what happened to the families of the victims.
How did you come up with the title Hell's 100 Acres?
It's I always found the term interesting. It's the neighborhood where my firehouse was, which encompasses this area where most of the factory lofts, a large number of the factory lofts in New York City were built at the time. The neighborhood was given that nickname later in the 20th century, around like the 1950s. The fire commissioner at the time called this neighborhood, he nicknamed it Hell's 100 Acres, because by that point, the factory lofts had changed, right? So now you have them built in the late 1800s. The factories and these, manufacturers, a lot of garments companies, they set up shop here. By the mid 20th centuries, they move. The first wave, they move to Jersey. Once transportation becomes better, they don't have to be near each other. They don't have to be near the shipping point. So they move. Air travel comes into play. So they move to wherever it's cheaper to manufacture. So a lot of these loft buildings are abandoned in the mid 20th centuries, and then so now this neighborhood, you have a lot of old abandoned buildings that are the scenes of a lot of deadly fires, and it was a dangerous area in a lot of ways to work as a firefighter. So they nicknamed the area Hell's 100 Acres from that. And it was always been like a little nickname almost for the firehouse I worked in. So, it was like bringing it into, but I think it's a good way of, looking at this neighborhood, because I think it's an important part of the story. I think the history of the factory lofts and, is an important part of the story. And it was really when I started out, the first spark of an idea was kind of to tell that story, through the eyes of my old firehouse and firefighting in this area and the factory loft. So I think it all ties in to the story.
Now, any plans on this also coming in audiobook form?
Perhaps. I know that's become more and more popular, and a lot of authors do. I have looked into it. I guess it's I'd love to do it. You gotta find a good narrator and put for an independent author, it can be some challenges for resources. It's not cheap to do it right.
No. Well, especially if you have different characters.
It's a big upfront expense, for it's worth it usually. I've looked into it on a lot of authors, they're very happy to have done it. So maybe, I would hope to be able to do it in the future.
get a lot of your buddies to record and do the characters.
Yeah.
That's all you got to do.
I do know a lot of characters.
So I take it you're self-published then?
Well, yeah, I kind of, over the years of putting books out and stuff, I basically, what most independent authors do, I form my own publishing company. Basically.
Okay. Oh.
So, and I use subcontractors for, like most, for editors and cover design and all that stuff,
So do any other authors publish through you?
I've thought about that, and
Mm-hmm.
now that I have the company set up, and I think that could be a direction I'm moving, because I do enjoy the process of putting a book together.
Right.
From manuscript to holding a book in your hand, it's really cool. When you get to that, it's a different type of operation. Obviously, once you move your publishing company to start representing other authors and stuff like that. But I do see that maybe in the future I could go in that direction, because I do enjoy the process.
Well, I want you to do me a huge favor. Well, actually, I want you to do the listeners a huge favor. If you can, really quick, tell them the other books and the story behind the other books that you've written, the other 7 books.
Yeah, like I said, the first one in 2012, The Dead Florentines, it's called. It's a historical novel about the Italian Renaissance, basically a family and some characters living in Florence at the height of the Italian Renaissance, right around in the early 1500s. And then in 2015, my next book it's called La Petite Parisienne. It's about the French Revolution. Oh, so that's that came out in 2015. And then my next book was a completely different direction. It was a nonfiction book. It was it's called Finding John. It's I like to describe it as half memoir, half like investigative history of my 9/11 experiences. And I was, people had asked me, over the years if are you ever going to write about 9/11? Knowing that I had put out other books, and I never really thought that I could. Years went by, and I said no, I don't think I ever will. It was a good 15 years after the events, and I think it was 2016. I just sat down one day and I said, you know what? Let me try something. And I wrote the first chapter, and I said, I think I could do this. I think it's okay. And then I turned around, and then I stopped, and I started, doing a lot of research and meeting, finding some witnesses, and it's not just a straightforward memoir. It's it's without telling too long of a story, but basically it's called Finding John because a firefighter named John Tipping. That's the where the name John comes from. Basically, in the months after the September 11th attacks, firefighters were doing rotating shifts down at the World Trade Center site during the recovery operation. So in March of 2002, myself and a team of firefighters were digging through the rubble, and we found the remains of a dead firefighter. His name was John Tipping, and I didn't know him in life. I'd never met him. And
still a brother, though.
Yeah, absolutely, still a brother, and I felt this connection to him. It was a moment in my life I'll obviously never forget. And then time goes by, and it's what happens is late in the year in 2002, a book is published from a journalist who spent time down at the recovery site. And he recounts the tale of the recovery operations at the World Trade Center site, and this author basically alleges that one crew of firefighters, a ladder company, arrived at the scene before the collapse of the towers. While they were burning upstairs, while people were dying and trying to evacuate, while the rescue is underway, this team of firefighters pulls up in front of the Twin Towers and basically decides that this is a good opportunity to steal some loot. According to this journalist, they entered the World Trade, because the Twin Towers had a concourse level below grade, and it was a shopping mall. So in the shopping mall were a number of stores, and according to him, this company went into the concourse level, found the Gap, the store, the Gap, found tons of clothing, including most of what he describes as stacks of jeans, and walked it up through the lobby, past chiefs and police officers and everything, and just whistled as they walked through the lobby with all this free loot, and started stacking it on their fire truck. And then the collapse happened, and that's how they died. That's the allegation that was made. And maybe outside of New York, it didn't get that much traction, this story, but it was a big deal. He was a famous, well-respected journalist, and the book was a bestseller. And it was very controversial at the time. Firefighters, we knew it was, it couldn't be true. There were protests outside some book signings that he had. And then the story just kind of, slowly, gradually
disappeared,
went away, like all new, the world moved on. But for me, I should get back. The latter company involved is where this firefighter, John Tipping, who remains a friend, that's where he worked.
Okay.
So the story goes on, and years go by, and it just ate away at me. I never got over that anger and that feeling that this terrible injustice was done. There had been a couple of articles, of like refuting the book, here and there. Nothing ever got publicity like the book did. None of the, So, it just ate away at me, and that's what I wanted to write about. So, when I say my book is half memoir, half investigative history, I tell the story of, what I was doing on September 11th and the months afterwards and what was going on. But I also focus on, I really wanted to set out to tell the true story of this company. And I tracked down witnesses to what they were doing, documentary evidence. There's film footage. There's, dispatch records from the fire department. And the story I pieced together is, these guys were heroes up until the last second of their lives. They saved, basically they were special called while the fire is unfolding to the Twin Towers, because in the South Tower lobby, the elevators had dropped when the impact happened of the planes. The elevators had dropped to the lobby, but they were jammed in the lobby, like half in between floors. They weren't lined up with the floor, and the doors wouldn't open. And people were trapped in these elevators. And jet fuel had poured into the elevator shafts, so there were fires at the base of these elevator shafts, and the people were trapped. So this crew of firefighters was called specifically to address the people trapped in these elevators. And I'm sure you've heard of what we call the jaws of life. What people So it's actually called a Hearst tool. There's other companies that make them, but the public knows it as the jaws of life. And now they're different. They're lighter, but back then it was a bulky tool. There was a generator, a large generator with hydraulic hoses, and then the tool, the spreaders themselves were these big, steel jaws that open up.
Yeah.
So it was, it wasn't the easiest thing to cart around. So they pulled their truck right up to the front door of the South Tower. That way they could carry, and there's debris falling outside. So, side note, that's why when the towers collapsed, the truck was pushed down into the concourse level. And when they excavated it, there were merchandise from the stores near the truck. So that was the germ of the rumor of this, They weren't stacked in the compartments or anything, but there was merchandise near the truck when they found the actual truck. But
fell on the store,
of course, but the guys themselves, the firefighters, they brought the jaws of life into the lobby. They rescued one woman who survived, and they put her in an ambulance. Other rescuers put her in an ambulance, and she lived. And they were still working on these elevator doors to get the rest of the people out of this elevator when the tower collapsed. So up until the last moment of their life, heroes in every sense of the word, and, so that's what I wanted to tell that story. And, that's where the idea for my book came about. And that's what I wanted to do.
With everything that you went through, especially being a firefighter, right, right there during 9/11, was that good therapy for you when you wrote the book?
Absolutely. And that's what,
Okay.
I was, I was holding on to a lot of anger over it, and putting the story together, I think, was my therapy of working through it, and talking to the families of this fire crew, and 15 years later, what, their experiences and, and it really did help me move forward in a lot of ways,
Good. And what were the other books? I need you need to come back on and I would love to have you come on and talk about that if you don't mind. Strictly about Finding John and about being a firefighter.
Yeah, for sure.
Because like I said in the beginning, I don't think as a Marine Corps veteran, we hear it all the time. Thank you for your service. But I don't believe first responders hear it enough. And I hope you don't get upset with me about saying this, but I think a lot of people don't realize when it comes to like PTSD and everything, and when it comes to battles, first responders have it worse, I believe, because you're seeing the stuff every day. A lot of people in the military may not ever see wartime.
Well, I think it's just different. It is different. And it may be more, and I don't know what's, maybe an intense exposure to something like that in the span of 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
But as opposed to a much
everything.
less intense version of it, over a 20 or 30 year career. I don't know what would be better or worse, and, I think it's on the individual experiences and,
So I'm sorry, what were the other books?
After that, I did another novel in 2021. I think I might have come out, I think January 2022. It's called Zuccotti Park. It's a short novella basically about the Occupy Wall Street movement in Lower Manhattan, which by the time the book came out, it had happened about 10 years earlier. So it's just a small little story about, just a New York family and, different dynamics of what, the backdrop of this Occupy Wall Street movement, is, the background, but it's basically what goes on with this, little group of characters and what's going on in their lives at the time. And then, this, I have, Hell's 100 Acres was the next book I put out, which, just came out last month.
So those of you listening, when you go and purchase, actually tell everybody the website first of all.
Well,
that would help.
Go andrewserra.com is my website, and there's links there to all my books and everything like that. The books are for sale on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever books,
everywhere
wherever you get your books. Yeah.
So those of you listening, when you purchase Hell's 100 Acres and Andrew's other books, and make sure you follow him on Amazon too. That way you'll be notified of new releases. Make sure you leave a full review, whether on Goodreads, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, wherever you can leave reviews. And purchase copies for other people as well. I think there's a lot of people that could learn a lot from this. So purchase them. Before I get to my last question, is there anything you would like to add?
I think we covered a lot of area here, which I'm very happy about. Nothing comes to mind that we missed.
Well, in that case, what's the next big thing for Andrew Serra?
Definitely no big thing planned at the moment. It was a long year plus of putting this book together. It's always a crunch time towards the end with final edits and design and all that stuff. And then the book's released, and now I'm right in the thick of publicity and marketing and making the rounds and trying to get the word out. So that's been my main focus right now. I have nothing really jumped into, into places like, oh, that's my next idea. I got to write about that. I find when you force them, they kind of don't happen, like even with this book, like I said, when I first retired, I was trying to figure out, I had a couple, I think I started 2 other books where I wrote like 20 or 30 pages, like, cause I'm looking around, I'm like, oh, that's the idea. Like that, I tried to make it the idea, and, it's like, full starts and stops, and, you get,
Right.
And then when sometimes when they just kind of grow organically, I think those are the best ideas like this. Like I said, it grew out of starting to be one thing, and then it kind of shifted into like this bigger overall story.
Andrew, I want to thank you so much. Everybody listening, again, make sure you purchase the books, leave a full review, and stay tuned for more books when he gets more ideas in his head. Andrew, thanks a lot.
This is great, Rich. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Conversations with Rich Bennett. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned something from it as I did. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you have a moment, I'd love it if you could leave a review. It helps us reach more listeners and share more incredible stories. Don't forget to connect with us on social media or visit our website at conversationswithrichbennett.com for updates, giveaways, and more. Until next time, take care, be kind, and keep the conversations going.